A refreshing breeze of positivity in a challenging international environment. China-ROK relations seem to be heading toward a new stage of development. Myung, President of the Republic of Korea, is in China for a state visit, the first by a South Korean president since 2017. China says the visit is playing an active role in promoting their strategic cooperative partnership, while President Lee has hailed the restoration of the ties as the greatest accomplishment above all of his government. Now, South Korea faces a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, as a regional ally of the United States. On the other, China has been its largest trading partner for over 2 decades. Yet, since coming into power last June, President Lee has rejected the traditional equation of relying for security on the U.S. and economically on China. With the ongoing China visit, he seems to have taken this stance to another level. How was the shift possible? What's the main takeaway for other countries in the region and beyond? Welcome to The Point with me, Liu Xin, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined from Columbus, Ohio by Robert Kelly, Professor of Political Science at Pusan National University, from San Francisco by KJ No, journalist and geopolitical analyst in Asia Pacific, and here in the studio by Rong Ing, senior research fellow at the China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, gentlemen, to this edition of The Point. Professor Kelly, let me go to you first. Now, this is, as I said, I find it a rather bright spot in a very precarious period of time. The news coming out of Venezuela, for instance, and yet, what came out of Beijing seems to be something rather refreshing. China and the ROK, improving, restoring their relationship. Is this what we are seeing? How would you rate the success so far of President Lee's visit?
Yeah, I think that's broadly correct. I think this particular South Korean president places a priority on relations with China. In part, that's because of the very erratic course pursued by South Korea's primary ally, the United States, under Donald Trump. Donald Trump is now deeply unpredictable for all U.S. allies, not just Denmark and Greenland and so on, right? But for all U.S. allies. And so for South Korea, that means that the U.S. is a very questionable force in its politics at the moment. And so better relations with its neighbors make sense. Japan is traditionally very difficult for South Korea because of the history there, which we've covered on this program before. And so China is really the other option. And so improving relations with China, as you pointed out, which is a major trading partner, is sort of high up on the agenda. Again, to sort of create some kind of balance between the U.S. and China. This is something that's been particularly important for South Korean progressives, for the South Korean left. This president is from the left, and this is something that the South Korean left has talked about for more than a decade. The previous president was a South Korean conservative, was much more, wary of China, but he's out because of the impeachment. And so you now have a president in there who generally wants sort of at least some kind of business-like relationship with China, if only to balance against the United States. And that balancing imperative has become more imperative as Donald Trump has become more erratic. And so I think that's really where China plays in for South Korea right now, that South Korea is trying to find a sort of way between these two, particularly as the U.S. becomes more unpredictable.
Mr. No, how would you put in terms of the shift that the South Korean president has pursued in terms of relationship with China? Last August, while giving an interview with an American magazine, he actually said the traditional equation of relying for security with the United States and economically on China is no longer viable. Has he translated that into more concrete policies by conducting this visit, for instance?
I believe so. It's still a work in progress. It's still early days, but the traditional formulation has been Anmi Kyung Jung, that is security with the United States and economy with China. I think this is changing, and I think it's a welcome change. As we all know, the previous president was extraordinarily hostile towards China. If essentially he was functioning as a cog inside the US's Indo-Pacific strategy. In fact, South Korea's Indo-Pacific strategy was essentially a clone of the US Indo-Pacific strategy, which is to say that it was continually escalating in hostility against China. This did not serve China, but certainly it did not serve South Korea. South Korea's economy was going down the tubes. And by having a complete turning of the leaf, shifting, I think there are some optimistic possibilities that we will start to see, most certainly in the areas of trade and tech and cultural exchange, as well as energy development.
Well, this is not new for China because over the past few years, China has witnessed, the negative consequences in its relationship with countries, especially countries in the region, when these countries find themselves or define their role as being caught in between a rock and a hard place, in a very similar scenario that South Korea would find itself. For national defense or security, it's relying on the United States or ally with the United States, but they're also trading huge with China. Mr. Rong Ing put the whole evolution of China-South Korea relationship into the broader context of what we're happening. And are we seeing a shift in the tide? What are the factors behind this shift?
Yeah, I think in general, I would agree with co-panelists' sort of insights on the backdrop or context where the South Korean, the new government, President Lee, is pursuing its diplomacy, which called, I think, pragmatic diplomacy. It is true, I think, the region and the world at large is undergoing dramatic changes, causing a lot of uncertainties and unpredictabilities, which makes, I think, every and each country impossible to pursue the old sort of policy. That is very much important. And I think for President Lee and his government, it is, of course, it took office against, again, the backdrop of a chaotic sort of development representing a lot of challenges and problems, and which I think he would have to focus mostly in terms of development, social economic problems. But that would have to be addressed in a favorable international or regional context. In this case, I think a stable relationship with China or a balanced sort of approach vis-a-vis China and the United States is very much important. And last but not least, I think this is the beginning of the new year, 2026. I think it is also in the wake of the successful state visit by President Xi, which represents the stabilizing or restoration of the relations. So keeping the momentum and working together with the Chinese leadership to ensure the trajectory will be positive and sort of forward-looking process would be very much important.
Professor Kelly, how are domestic media perceiving this visit and the shift in terms of policy? And also, what are the general sentiments of the public? Because over the past few years, the public opinion about China in South Korea, I understand, have also experienced a rather low tide. How are the general public reacting to President Lee's new policy towards China?
Sure. So I think most of the coverage in South Korea is on the sort of informal Hallyu ban or K-culture ban in China, which is something that South Koreans have really been trying to push China on a lot since the conflict over missile defense. U.S. installed missile defense in South Korea about a decade ago. And this is something where the South Koreans and Chinese have really gone back and forth a lot. K-culture, as the Koreans like to call it, is a big South Korean culture export. You have all this South Korean cultural content, K-pop and all this stuff all over Netflix and stuff like that. And China, as we've discussed, is a big export market. And this is something that the Koreans really want. And it's all over the media, to answer your question there. I think the larger issue, though, I think the more important issue is the one you also mentioned, which is very, very low approval rating that China has in the South Korean public. I think this puts a really strict limit on just how far this leftist South Korean president can go in a rapprochement with China, because he's going to face massive blowback in South Korea if it looks like he gives up anything meaningful on, for example, conflicts in the Yellow Sea. There are some disputes over Chinese structures there. I don't know if we're going to talk about that. But the South Korean public is not going to give an inch on that. I would be really, really surprised. In fact, the public opinion is really quite negative, in fact. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the language around this has been kind of vague. It's all sort of, we got to get along, and there's a new page, and we're turning over a new leaf, and it's a new year, and all that kind of stuff. But that doesn't actually really get to the strategic issues, for example, sort of like North Korean nuclear weapons, and to what extent can China help on that, right? There's a lot of dancing around I think the core issues, the core strategic issues and trade issues, right, in the interest of kind of like general language about rapprochement and getting along and stuff like that. And that's almost certainly on the South Korean side, which I can speak to. I think that's almost certainly because of the tight constraints of public opinion. And if I were China, that's what I would really be thinking about. Like, how can Chinese soft power, for example, sort of improve China's reputation in South Korea to give the South Korean government more space to engage the Chinese government.
Well, a lot of China's image is not really shaped by China on the, on foreign platforms. Let's say it's very often, how China's image is depicted by other voices. But anyway, that is an interesting point, Professor Kelly, you have raised. But my question still is, and I would turn to Mr. No, how has this been possible? Because President Lee has actually been very high profile with his policy towards China. For instance, he was using a selfie, right, that was given as a gift from President Xi to take a selfie for the couple, and he was using some languages as, for instance, the picture of a lifetime, and he was posting these pictures on the international social media platform. What gave him the belief, though, the confidence that these kind of messages will go down well with the Korean general public, which have been very negative, let's say, towards China, if not towards the Chinese people?
Well, I think the first thing to point out is that negative portrayal of China is, as you point out, strongly influenced by right-wing forces in the United States and then propagated through US controlled social media. And so I think we really have to understand that as a form of information warfare vis-a-vis China that is being conducted inside of Korea in order to split Korea off from good relations with China. So I think it's a little bit disingenuous to say that this is some kind of organic, vox populi. It's not that at all. I think we really have to understand this as a kind of a coordinated information campaign, which South Korea has been subjected to by the United States in order to further its geostrategic, geopolitical goals. That said, I think that it will go over quite well. I mean, young people are used to taking selfies. It's a very, Gen Z or millennial type of a action. I think it signals warm-hearted casualness. It's if you will, a kind of electronic embrace. It's a way that you are signaling that we see ourselves together. It's casual and playful. And remember, the phone that he used to take the picture was actually a gift from President Xi Jinping. So once again, it's kind of affirming that this is a useful gift for us, that it allows us to see ourselves together. So on that level, I think it will resonate very well with the vast majority of Koreans, certainly young Koreans. And I also want to point out that right now, the major trend for young Koreans on the weekend is actually to take a trip to Shanghai.
Wow. I didn't know that. That's something new to me. But it's very interesting, and I like to hear news like that, because I believe at the end of the day, it's really people-to-people exchanges that really matters between country. And I'm very happy to hear that, for instance, both President Xi and President Lee talk about people-to-people exchanges. Mr. Rong, what can we expect? Really, are we going to see a new scenario in terms of interactions between the two countries? It's been too gloomy. It's been too frustrating, right? The news coming out of China-ROK relations. Are we going to see? Do you expect to see that? Are we going to see real improvement in bilateral ties going forward?
Very much so. I think I'm certainly very much hopeful in the sense that China and ROK are close neighbors, and we have shared, sort of a sense of history and culturally. You can look at everything, in terms of neighborhood. So this is very much important sort of foundation for people-to-people interactions. And unfortunately, because for the past almost 1 decade, because of the political relationship, because of the geopolitics, and most importantly, I believe the third sort of positive factors, the relationship has been suffered. But what suffered most is the people-to-people interactions and the sentiment towards each other. And what I think has changed in the past year, particularly I think as the new government, President Lee took office, we have seen a strengthened sort of efforts by the two sides, as we have just discussed. I mean, led by the top leadership, the president himself, and also in case of China, of course, President Xi and other leaders have very much focused on that. And that would, of course, take time to overcome the sort of problems arising from that. But the most important thing is we have now seen more and more positive stories. Certainly, the selfie is one, and the other, the President Lee's sort of stories about the fashion that the young people or younger generations of Korea, I mean, coming to spend, weekend in Shanghai. Certainly, there are other stories even in terms of the two countries that are helping and sacrificing their life for each other. For example, I think back in June or last year, there was a police officer and gave his life to save, Chinese in Korea, and also there's a Chinese driver, a bus driver, again, sacrificed his life for the safety of Korean tourists in Zhangjiajie and Hunan province. So there are more and more focus or publicities around this land. And of course, the popularity of K-pops is still very much, I think, well, and also I think more and more Chinese sort of cultural activities along this line. So the decision of the two leaders during the visit to resume, exchanges in culture, exports, goals, footballs, and cultural events are very much, I think, good and exciting. And I only hope that it will help prepare more ground for closer interactions.
Well, it is going to be a very delicate relationship and a very delicate relationship to balance for the President Lee's administration. He was in the United States after he won the election, after he took office last year, and he was talking to President Trump about, the ironclad alliance between the United States, Japan, and the ROK in Northeast Asia. Professor Kelly, so given the kind of pragmatism that President Lee has demonstrated, how is he going to balance these two parts of the relationship, especially if you look at the old equation of relying on the U.S. for security and relying on China for economy? Was this a viable equation in the first place? Do you see anything wrong with that kind of mentality?
Well, I'm not really sure what President Lee will put in its place. People have been talking about that for a while, and people have mentioned for a while, particularly with Donald Trump's rise and the unreliability that Donald Trump has raised with U.S. commitments, right? You see this argument that South Korea maybe needs some space from the United States and needs to sort of explore a more balanced relationship with its neighbors. That narrative is strongest on the South Korean left. There's also kind of a growing sense that maybe South Korea should build its own nuclear weapons so that South Korea can just sort of disjunct from the whole region and not have to deal with China or the U.S. or Japan at all, which would be sort of independent and nuclear armed. It's not really clear to me, though, that the South Korean public is, one, ready to support nuclearization, or two, is really ready to support the kind of major defense buildup that would be necessary for South Korea to actually break away from the U.S. alliance and stand on its own and pursue a more independent policy towards China. Ultimately, the constraint on this idea that South Korea doesn't need the U.S. anymore for security or something like that is that South Korean taxpayer would have to pay substantially more for South Korean defense. You'd probably have to expand conscription. You'd probably have to conscribe women. You might have to build nuclear weapons. For South Korea to actually break away from the U.S. alliance would require a major defense buildup here because South Korea is in a pretty tough neighborhood. And I just don't know if the South Korean public was willing to support that. In fact, I would argue that they're not. I would argue that the South Korean public has actually become quite comfortable under the U.S. security blanket for many years. And so even if the South Koreans want to trade more with China and they want some more space from the United States, which I think is something the South Korean political left wants a lot, the rest of the public, I just don't know if they're going to go along with that, right? Because it would require South Korea to really sort of pursue a level of strategic autonomy it's just never chosen before. And I think that's why eventually Myung, the current president, right, went and talked about the ironclad alliance with the United States, which is some language you don't traditionally hear from the South Korean left, which is traditionally understood the U.S. alliance as kind of neo-imperial or sort of interventionist in South Korean politics. But the South Korean public really supports the alliance. Even if they're very uncomfortable with Donald Trump, they're really supportive of the alliance, if only because it helps South Korean security costs. It helps sort of backstop the South Korean economy, having the U.S. military on the ground. And so for South Korea to really break that traditional relationship that you were talking about would require kind of a revolution on the ground in South Korean public opinion. And I just don't see that. Like we said, the South Korean public opinion on China is quite negative. South Korean public opinion on the U.S. alliance, if not Trump, on the alliance is very positive. And so even if this government wants to pursue that, I don't know if the public support is there to do it.
Mr. No, yeah, this perpetual question of how to deal with the world's two largest economies and two largest militaries very soon, I believe, is not just a question for South Korea, but also for countries such as Japan, such as Australia, and and China is the number one, or one of the most important trading partners for over 150 countries in the world. So this question seems to be more and more prominent as we go further. Do you see a way out of the similar dilemma? I mean, is there a way that countries can develop their relationship with China on the one hand and with the United States on the other hand without having to pick side or clear sides?
Well, I think it would be possible if the US was not forcing these countries to pick sides. It's not China which is asking any country to pick a side. It is the United States which is essentially telling them either explicitly or implicitly, you're with us or against us. This was seen in the Biden administration. We saw this going all the way back to Obama. And certainly in this administration, I'm sure there's a lot of pressure being put on. So all of this kind of boils back down to the fact that, if we want to understand Korean politics, you have to understand that there is a dark sun whose gravitational force determines the orbits of the Korean body politic. That dark sun is the United States and its geostrategic, geopolitical interests in squelching and containing China. And Korea is being used as a proxy in that system. It's a cog in that machine. And so, for example, when we talk about, for example, the North Korean threat, North Korea, as far as South Korea is concerned, is not a threat. North Korea's military budget is less than a Taylor Swift concert tour budget. It is 1/3 of the budget of the NYPD. It is not a threat, except that the United States wants to weaponize South Korea as a battering ram against China, using North Korea as a stalking horse. This is the core issue that we're facing right now. And I assure you, the vast majority of critically thinking Koreans do not agree with this. In fact, one of the policies or one of the platforms that Lee Jae-myung put forth in his electoral campaign was to prevent the use of Korea being used as a proxy or a battering ram for the United States.
Mr. Rong, what kind of strategic opportunity does China offer for the ROK and for the Korean Peninsula?
Well, definitely, I think China's policies, China's strategy towards the Korean Peninsula and the Northeast Asia has been, as a whole, has always been consistent. China is and was and is and will be a force for stability and for positivity. This is very much so. This is, very simple, because a stable and peaceful environment, neighborhood, would be serve the best interest for China to pursue its own national development strategy, the Chinese modernization. And unfortunately, I think if we look at, the changes or the changing perceptions over the past years, and particularly in the context when the United States has adopted a policy that to contain or suppress China's development. And it created problems for South Korea and others, particularly the U.S. neighbors, allies, to face up a kind of a challenge that how to develop its own right perception of China and the relation between China and the United States. I think if any lessons that can be learned, or if we look at the past 10 years, particularly in the two previous administrations in ROK, I think the good lesson is that while ROK, from China's perspective, pursue its relationship with the United States, it should not came at the expenses of Chinese legitimate concerns and interests. That is very much so. So I think if President Lee would like to have really pursue its pragmatism or pragmatic diplomacy, it is more than a question of change, sort of a kind of a paradigm or equation. Rather, I think in pursuing its own strategy, it would have to, first and foremost, keep in mind what would be serve the best interest for its China policy and the United States policy, and relationship between China and the United States. That is the most fundamental thing, if I can say, in terms of strategy.
Okay, Professor Kelly, my last question to you in 20 seconds, if I may. Yeah, going forward, what would you look out for personally? You have been studying, Korean Peninsula for decades. What would you say to be the most crucial thing to watch out for President Lee to really put in his vision into reality?
Sure, I think he has to move South Korean public opinion on China. It's, as we talked about, it's really negative. The issues, I would argue, are not simply derived from Facebook and social media. They turn on things like North Korea's nuclear weapons program, China's participation or non-participation in the sanctions regime, the Hallyu ban. There are a lot of strategic issues with the LOC. There are a lot of genuine strategic issues between the two of them. And unless there's some movement on that, South Korean public opinion is going to remain fairly fixed. It's possible Donald Trump will undermine that. I'm not so sure. But without that movement of South Korean public opinion, there's only so much the South Korean left can do to sort of push them on.
I understand. Mr. No, what is your take?
I actually disagree. I think there is a vast amount of well-intentioned feelings towards China that are now coming to the fore. And people look at a leader and they will see the kind of warm relationships, the warm engagement that he has with China, and most recently his visit to Shanghai. I have to tell you that when you visit Shanghai, it is very often a very moving experience for Koreans.
He did talk about emotion. Yeah, he did talk about emotions. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go into details there. It has a lot of historical significance. One sentence, Mr. Rong. What does China have to do to take care of this new trend? One sentence.
From Chinese perspective, I think we definitely would like to work with ROK to pursue a relationship, a stable and healthy relationship in line with the changes in the region. Yeah.
We have to leave it at 30 seconds left. Robert Kelly, KJ, No, and Rowing, thank you so much for sharing with us your insights. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Li Shan. Thanks for watching. You've got the point.